Now we discuss the issue of prejudice, confusion, and a waste of time. In the chapter we are discussing relevancy, we know a very basic principle in evidence law is only relevant evidence is admissible, irrelevant evidence is not admissible. That is a true statement, but we also need to know it is not the case. We would admit all relevant evidence, or in another way to put it is this: not all relevant evidence will be admitted. All relevant evidence, we have to say, is admissible, but not necessarily the court would admit all relevant evidence. This is also very important for us to remember. So in this section, we are going to discuss under what kind of circumstances the court may exclude relevant evidence. So basically we say if we have this issue of unfair prejudice, if we would admit this relevant evidence, but this relevant evidence may cause unfair prejudice, may cause confusion, or may cause this waste of time, and then the court may exclude relevant evidence. First, let's look at this waste of time. This one is easy to understand. Suppose we have this fight, and there were 20 people who actually witnessed this fight. Not necessarily that all 20 people would come to court to testify to the same event. If there is a fight and then we have 20 people who witnessed this fight, maybe the court would say maybe you can ask maybe 5 of them to testify. Maybe that is sufficient. If you ask all these 20 people to testify, that is going to be waste of time. So the court would say, even though all these 20 people's testimony would be relevant, but the court would not permit all 20 people to come to court to testify about the same thing. So that is a very clear example as to what we mean by under certain circumstances, the court may exclude relevant evidence. Confusion of the issues and also misleading the jury. If admission of an item of evidence may have the effect of confusion of the issues or misleading the jury, the court may also decide the evidence would not be admissible. Suppose we have this, look at this example, and we have this item on trial for a sorting bill. So the issue is, can the prosecution offer evidence to show Adam on 2 previous occasions assaulted Bill? Maybe the prosecution would say 3 months before and also 9 months before. On 2 occasions, Adam also assaulted Bill. We have to say this evidence is relevant. We know Adam is on trial for assaulting Bill, but on 2 previous occasions, Adam assaulted Bill also. This evidence, we have to say it is relevant. Why it is relevant? Because that shows Adam does not like Bill. That's why he just keeps coming to him and just beating him up. So we cannot say this evidence is not relevant. The evidence is relevant, but would the court admit this evidence? The court would not admit this evidence because, first of all, we know this is going to be character evidence. We're going to discuss this issue in Chapter 3. So for that reason, the court would not permit this evidence. But this evidence would also have the effect of confusing the issue and misleading the jury. The reason is this. We know Adam is on trial for this assaulting Bill on this particular occasion. So whether Adam should be convicted or not should be determined by whether there is a sufficient evidence to indicate on this particular occasion Adam assaulted Bill. But if the prosecution would introduce evidence 3 months before, 9 months before Adam assaulted Bill, and then this jury probably could be confused because you presented the evidence Adam assaulted Bill this time, this Adam assaulted Bill on 2 previous occasions, and then the jury probably could not really tell which evidence is which. And then maybe 3 months ago, and then they thought that evidence was very strong. Maybe the jury would really believe that was what happened this time. So that is really what we mean. That is an example that can show us under certain circumstances, if certain evidence is introduced, that would really confuse the issue. The issue is really this: whether Adam should be guilty of this criminal assault on this particular occasion. It all depends on whether the prosecution has the evidence to show Adam on this occasion committed this criminal assault. But if you presented evidence of on other 2 previous occasions, Adam also assaulted Bill, that may well confuse the jury as to which evidence is which. So that is another reason why the court would not permit this kind of evidence. Another ground that relevant evidence may be excluded is if this evidence may cause unfair prejudice. By unfair prejudice, we mean the presentation of the evidence may make the jury make a decision on an improper basis. Commonly, this so-called improper basis would be an emotional one. For example, bias, sympathy, hatred, contempt, retribution, or horror. Most specifically, and in this case, where oftentimes the most commonly encountered issue in real trial would be the presentation of these gruesome photos. Whether this presentation of the gruesome photos should be admitted or not. We know in the chapter we have this case about this. We have this case about this sexual assault and murder cases committed by the defendant, and then in the case, the prosecution wanted to introduce a lot of crime scene photos and also post-autopsy photos, and then the defendant actually raised objection, saying that those are gruesome photos, and then the photos were actually evidence of inflammatory nature, and the evidence should be excluded. But of course, we also know the ruling of the court was the photos should be admitted. So this issue is directly related to this unfair prejudice. Meaning is whether the jury may actually render a decision on an improper basis. Take this example. We know in this case, and then the victim was a young girl, and then the young girl was sexually assaulted and also murdered. And then because of the nature of the case, we know the jury must be feel very angry, feel very indignant as to why someone would do this to the victim. And then in the courtroom, because of this feeling, because of this hatred for the perpetrator, and then maybe the jury would have this feeling to seek this retribution. But at this in courtroom, the defendant was only one. That is the defendant is only one that is being accused of committing this crime. So the concern is maybe the jury would not really consider whether there is sufficient evidence indicating the defendant's guilt simply because they want to seek this retribution, they want to because of their sympathy for the victim, so they want to get this defendant convicted. So basically, that is what we mean by the concern over this. The jury may make this decision based on their emotion instead of based on the sufficiency of the evidence presented by the prosecutor. So these are gruesome photos. Oftentimes, the issue of gruesome photos is oftentimes is a contested issue in a real trial. The defense would say, "Oh, these photos, crime scene photos, they are really gruesome." And then if you show the photos to the jury, and then maybe they would have this horror, maybe they would have this sympathy for the victim, and then maybe they are going to render the decision on an improper basis. But the prosecution would argue these photos are relevant because if that is how the crime is committed, we have to present these photos to the jury. So basically, we need to understand that is an argument that often we would often see in real criminal trials. It is important for us to understand this. When we have this kind of arguments between the prosecution and the defense, the court in general would give more weight to the evidence probative value than the danger of unfair prejudice. Meaning is, if the prosecution is going to present these crime scene photos, or maybe these post-autopsy photos, and if these photos are necessary to prove the case, the court usually would permit the admission of these photos, even though the defense may argue these photos these photos are inflammatory nature and then may cause this unfair prejudice. The court would give more weight to the probative value of the evidence. This approach is understandable because if the crime is committed in such a brutal way, the defendant cannot argue, and simply because we do not want to shock the jury, and then we want to exclude these photos. If the defendant really believes these photos are so gruesome and to show this horror of the crime scene, and then the question is why the defendant committed the crime in that fashion. So certainly the argument would not be, and then if you say because this concern over these gruesome photos, and then we are going to exclude these gruesome photos, and then maybe the message to these potential criminals would be maybe just commit this crime in a very cruel way, and then this evidence would not be admitted. Of course, we cannot accept that argument. So it is important for us to remember in this, even though we have this gruesome photo concern, but the court in general would give more weight to the evidence probative value. If the prosecution can show we need this evidence to prove the case, the court usually will support the prosecution's argument.